everyone, and welcome once again to our Sunrise Project call on this beautiful Sunday morning. I am always grateful to have you here with us in this safe space that is here for us to share and to be vulnerable and to help heal ourselves and our children. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I am super excited to have with us this morning a very special guest, Medina Jett, with us. And Medina is coming to us from Atlanta, Georgia. She says always she is mother first. She has three young adults, and she was thrust into the world of mental illness when her son was diagnosed with a mental illness while in college 5 years ago. She is now an advocate for destigmatizing mental illness and raising awareness on this national epidemic. And it sure is a national epidemic. Medina's book is called Peace, Be Still, Navigating My Son's Bipolar Disorder. And the book takes audiences along on her journey from her son's initial bipolar diagnosis through her reflective analysis of how she has parented her Black son and the societal factors that possibly played a part in his diagnosis. Medina shares the red flags that she missed along the way that parents might use as potential indicators of underlying mental health conditions. And her personal story, as you will hear in just a few minutes, is incredibly inspirational and educational. Peace Be Still shares her journey and how she has managed this challenge and what she calls our broken mental health system. A little bit more about Medina before we start the conversation. She has been a C-suite executive at three Fortune 100 companies. She was also founder and president of an award-winning international business and in the asset management industry. And now she is pursuing her passion for real estate with her newest entrepreneurial venture called TDS Builders, which she co-founded with her youngest daughter. She has received many, many, many awards, including the Anti-Defamation League's Torch of Liberty Award for her advocacy, the Urban League of Southern Connecticut's Diversity Award, the Tri-State Diversity Council's Influential Woman Award, and I could go on and on. Lastly, I'll share that Medina earned her BA from Wesleyan University, a JD from Georgetown Law School, and an MBA from the University of Connecticut School of Business. She is a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Our sister, I'm a Delta, but that's all good. We love our sisters.
E9 family.
We are all family. And she is a lifelong resident of Connecticut and now calls Atlanta home. So, Medina, thank you so much for getting up and being here with us on this Sunday morning. We
Thank you so
appreciate
much for
you.
having me, Kelly. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I want to get started by asking you really simply to share your story, share your journey about your son and how you were thrust into this space.
Sure. So 5 years ago, I was having a pretty average day at home and had been having daily conversations with my son about some challenges he was having with professors at his school. And he was under the impression that the professors were racist. He went to Bowdoin College in Maine, if anyone is familiar.
Mhm.
And so it wasn't surprising that he had these thoughts. And I was kind of talking him through how to handle it. I said, "You want me to call the dean?" He said, "No, no, no, I can't have my mother calling the school. I'll deal with it." But
Right.
each day he was getting more and more worked up, more and more wound up about this thing until maybe a week later, I got a call from the dean at the school, and I assumed she was calling about this situation, and Trey had gone to meet with her. And she said, "You need to get to campus right away. There's something very wrong with Dre." And I couldn't imagine what she was talking about. And I tried to get more out of her as to what's very wrong. And she said, "You just need to get here." And so I called Dre's father, my ex-husband, and he's about maybe 45 minutes away from me. And we both throw some things in a bag and we start to drive towards the school. And while I was throwing things in a bag, I got a call from my oldest daughter who lives in LA. And she was near tears. And she told me that my son had put up a post on social media
Mm,
that, and I don't recall the exact words, but it was something about suicide or led her to feel like that was a real imminent danger. And so that just really threw me for a loop.
mhm,
And as we were racing from Connecticut to Maine, we were able to get Dre on the phone and found out where he was. He was sitting in his car. And as we tried to talk to him to figure out what was going on, it was that he was not of his right mind. He was spouting things like, we gotta hurry up and end this call. The government's listening. Don't you hear that sound? The whole government's taken over capitalist and they're out to get us, mom. Don't you know that? And I was just, so confused as to what was happening. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking maybe somebody slipped something into his weed because
mhm,
the cannabis thing with Dre and I had gone on for years,
right,
where he started smoking weed in high school. And I kept telling
right,
him, your brain is not fully developed. It can't take that type of chemical imbalance and
right,
influence. But I kept hoping and praying that that's what it was. And
right.
so when hours later, me and his dad finally make it to campus, the person that I saw was not my son.
Yeah.
He was someone, it's like someone had taken over his mind. He was racing a mile a minute. He was asking questions like, do you know why zebras have stripes? Do you and his eyes were popping out of his head, and
Mm,
all like my body just froze up. And then I kept saying, okay, stay calm, there's a solution for this, because I tend to be the problem solver. If there's a problem, I'm going to find the answer. And so I
mhm,
tried to talk to him calmly and respond the way I always do, which is, Dre, if you have a question about something, just Google it. Like Google can tell you everything. And I don't want to Google it. Google's taken over by capitalists. Don't you know that? And this
mhm,
went on until, I mean, the story goes on from there, where we ended up having to take him to the mental health hospital there in Maine.
mhm,
And there's a section of the book which I'll probably get into later as we talk about the refusal treatment piece. But that was the start of a
mhm,
5-year journey in terms of
mhm,
what is happening, how do I manage it, how do I manage him, how do I make sure that he is getting what he deserves
mhm,
from this mental health care system,
mhm,
how do I ensure that he stays safe when he's having an episode and can't think clearly and can't think about his own safety from the public around him or from the police who are supposed to be here to protect him.
mhm.
And
It's been a
it's
journey.
been tough. Yeah.
It's been tough. Can I ask, when that happened and you went to Maine to get him, you and your ex, you went up there and you were hoping, as you said, that this, what you said, I don't see my son. I'm thinking this cannabis induced psychosis, which is real and it's really serious,
Mhm.
a real condition, cannabis induced psychosis. So you were hoping that was what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then how did you get him to go with you to the hospital? Because he was already 18, correct?
Yeah, he was 20 at the time. And so we stayed with him all night as these episodes were coming and going. And he would lay down on the bed, and you could tell he was just so tired. And then he'd spring up and he'd pull out
Yeah.
this notebook that he had with all these equations on it. And if he could solve the equation, he could save the world. And I started having shortness of breath, and it was a very real shortness of breath. I think I was having a panic attack.
Yeah.
And I then said, I think I need to go to the hospital. And his dad realized that me going to the hospital also meant Dre would go to the hospital. And so we both start saying, Dre, like, I need to go to the hospital. I need to get there. My chest is hurting. And he said, no, we go to the hospital. That's what they want. That's what they want. That's what they are. You
Mm,
can't trust the doctors. They're part of them. And I thought, oh my God, we're never going to get him to a hospital ever.
right, right.
The next morning, I called the mobile crisis team in Maine, and they said, call the police. And I said, oh, hell to the no, because that was
Right. You
right
don't
in
want
the
to put him
middle
in the
of
system and you're worried.
right in the middle of Black men being killed by the police like every week, it seemed. And there was no way I was going to do that. And so the next morning, the deans
Mm,
called and they wanted a meeting with us and Dre. And so we get to the meeting, and Dre is very agitated. He's barking orders at people and just very rude. And clearly, whatever was happening with him was still happening. They said that in order for Dre to return to school, that he had to have a psychological evaluation.
I see.
And I said,
Mhm.
we got to go to the hospital. That done. And Dre said, well, I don't even want to return to school. And I said, well, you still need to have a psychological evaluation. If you expect to get in our car and drive back to Connecticut, I need to know what's going on with you. And
Right.
so he finally agreed, because the only option was to leave him there in Maine, which obviously I was never going to do. But I eventually learned that bribery does have its place sometimes in this situation. And so we got in the car, and unbeknownst to us, the school had called ahead to the hospital and told them what was going on and to expect us. And there's a section of the book where I talk about that experience. And if you guys will oblige me, it's so much easier for me to read it than to
Please,
try
please.
to explain it. Um, so the section goes, and this is as we walk into the actually, it was just the emergency room at the hospital in Brunswick. When we arrived, it was obvious that the school had called ahead. Without us even having to give our names, the registration nurse escorted us to an exam room outfitted like an asylum. The walls had metal partitions so that equipment and supplies were not visible. There were no chairs, nothing, just a bed in the middle of the room with arm and leg straps. Dre took one look inside and immediately tried to bolt. A group of 6 security guards had followed us to the room, and they all physically pushed him into the room while his father and I tried to get out of the way of the stampede. All the while, I screamed for them not to hurt my son. Once they got him onto the bed, they tried to strap his legs down, but Drake kicked his left foot out, landing his size 12 Timberland boot squarely on the chest of a female guard. I didn't realize until she was kicked that she wasn't a man, but the wind was knocked out of her. And as all of this was happening, the doctor rushed in and injected Dre with the sedative in his thigh. Dre looked at me and asked, "Why are you letting them do this to me, Mom?" And then he was out. My heart broke right then in that hospital room.
Mm, mhm.
Did I make a mistake in bringing him here? Is this what he needs, or are they harming him? Are they treating him this way because he's a Black man? This was all so new to me. I didn't know what to expect. The sedative did calm him down, but what was in it? Would it have harmful side effects? The doctor should have discussed this with us first, but there
Mm,
had been no time. Drake kicked that woman really hard. I hoped she was okay. Dre had never assaulted a woman. He had also never ever been caged before. He fought for his life the way we had taught him to. Oh God, this was all way too much. With my head spinning and my heart aching, I walked outside to get some air and to cry privately. I kept thinking, what the hell is happening? This is not my life. This is
mm,
not my son. God, please help us.
mm. Well, I feel that every word that you said, and I appreciate you being so vulnerable to share, because that is can only be really difficult when someone, my son was calling, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, help me,"
Yeah,
as he's been carried out of the house 3 times, and it,
yeah.
broke my heart because they're calling for mom to help, and
Like,
you're doing what you think is right,
and
right?
yeah, we can only do what we think they
That's right.
need, but
Mhm.
it's so new, we don't know, really.
Right, and you said he had never been caged before. That word
That's
has
what it
such
felt like.
power. Mm. So you, thank you for sharing that. I just want to say that again.
Sure.
And it was powerful. And the book is Peace Be Still, Navigating My Son's Bipolar Disorder. So please get it. You can get it at Jet Speaks, JETT speaks.com.
Yes. It's also available on Amazon.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
But
sure.
back to that story. So you were in this hospital in Maine, and they sedated him. And did he, when he was awakened, that's when he got tested? Like, how did you know that this was the diagnosis?
So yeah, so when he woke, he was still very groggy, but he was also very angry with me. And
Yes.
that was the start of a trend that I could never for the life of me understand. Like, I'm the one person in this earth who's got your back. You
That's right.
know, father's siblings, he came of me, right? So but he was always so angry. And I think it started with me talking him into going to the hospital that very first time and
Yeah.
him looking me in my eyes as they were injecting him with that needle and wondering, why are
Yes.
you letting this happen to me? And so when he came to, he was very, very hostile. And he obviously kept saying, get me out of here. I want to leave. And I kept saying, Dre, you can't. Like, there's something very wrong and we need to figure out what it is. Um, I had called a friend who knows, I always say friend knows a little bit about everything. And he kept saying, get a toxicology test, have them run a tox scan, find out what's in his system, because it could be that he had bad drugs. And I said,
Right.
well, he doesn't smoke anything but weed, but yeah, we'll do that. And
Absolutely.
so trying to get Dre to pee in a cup was turned out to be so much more challenging than it ever should have been, because Dre was convinced that they wanted to take his DNA, and the government was trying to get his DNA through his urine, and he
Mm.
refused to comply. And so eventually he had to go to the bathroom, and they kept saying, you can't go to the bathroom until you take this cup and you pee in this cup. And so eventually he gave in. He went in and peed in the cup, and the results came back with totally clean except for THC, which, as we know, is weed.
We. Mhm.
Um, and so at that point, it started to set in like, well, if this isn't drugs, like what is going on? Like, what happened to him? And so the doctor came in, he talked to him, and he asked Trey if he had ever had any thoughts of suicide. And to my shock, Trey said yes.
Mhm.
And that's when that's the test, right? Of being able to commit him involuntarily. And so they then called upstairs to the behavioral health floor, as we came to know as the psych ward, and they didn't have any beds, which was another thing that became the common
Right.
trend.
No beds
The
available.
psych wards are all just full. And so he ended up waiting, I think it was something like 48 hours in the ER until a bed opened. And that's when they transferred him upstairs, to a place that none of us had any indication of what that was going to be like. But going up to visit him and seeing these zombie like people, overly medicated, wandering around, Dre was terrified of being there, even though he was not of his right mind. He knew that this was a scary place. And I think that whole experience, the first day at the hospital in the ER, and being up in that psych ward for the first time, put such a distaste in his mouth and a fear in him for
Yeah.
being committed, that that began our journey of, I do not want to go to the hospital. Trey, you have to go to the hospital. And it was all because of that first
That
experience.
first
So
experience.
awful.
So awful. So did you, but because he had mentioned, the suicidal ideation, they, did they assume custody basically of him and force him to stay?
Yeah, so they have what's known as a 48-hour hold.
Yes.
When someone is in danger of hurting themselves or others, they have a right to basically involuntarily commit them just for 48 hours. After that, the patient has to agree to continue to stay.
Got it. Got
And
it.
it's typically 48 hours, but if they get you in there and you're clearly not stable within 48 hours, I think they have some leeway to extend the stay involuntarily,
Right.
but their
Got it.
role is just to keep you until you're stable. And
Right.
then they rotate out and get someone else in who needs to get
Got
stable.
it. So you got him to stay. So I just, you got him to stay, and he stayed in the behavioral health unit.
He was there for, seems like maybe 5 or 6 days.
Okay. And then what happened next? Like, I want to just hear the rest, keep sharing on your
So
journey.
yeah, so we were coming to visit him every day. My daughter, the one from LA, as this was all happening, she immediately packed her bags, hopped on a flight. And while he was still in the ER, I see my daughter come running down the hall.
Mhm.
And we're all very, very close. So it didn't surprise me that she was terrified as well as to what was going on with her little brother. And she came, my ex-husband and his girlfriend came. We had a big debate as to whether my youngest daughter, who was like 16, 17 at the time, had a big debate as to whether she should come because
Mhm.
I didn't want her to be traumatized by what was happening.
Right.
And it was part of that protection of the baby and the family. Um, but after a while, my ex-husband and my oldest daughter, their opinions ruled one out. And my youngest daughter came, and it was surprising to me how much the two girls were grounded in mental health and mental illness
Yeah.
and what it looked like for people in their generation, and just how gracious they were around understanding
Yeah.
him.
Yes.
And so we would go visit him several times a day. Whenever they had visiting hours, we would be there. He would come into the waiting area, and we would try to get a sense for how he was doing, but he was still very agitated. And I just thought that he would stay there for quite some time because, in my opinion, he was not getting better.
I see.
And then, lo and behold, like day 4, they said they were discharging him.
Oh,
And we were like, wait, what? Like, he is not ready to get discharged. Like, where is he going to go? Like, he can't go back to school. He didn't want to go back to school. We would have to take him back to Connecticut. And I just thought it was way too early to discharge him. But again, that was something I came to realize was a repeat thing where they're constantly discharging him way before he was ready to be released. And when they ended up discharging him, it was a lot, because this was the first time that we would be left alone with him in that mental state. And it was also the first time that I realized how smart Trey was, because
absolutely. Brilliant, I'm sure.
we
Brilliant.
sat in a family meeting with his team, his psychiatrist and the social worker and the nurse. And Dre smiled and nodded, and they said, "And you're going to have to take your medication." Yes, sir. He nodded. "And you're going to have to go into therapy when you get back to Connecticut." "Okay, okay, I'm willing to do that." And he just seemed so agreeable with everything. And the minute we walked out the door, that person came back,
Yeah.
and it was just me and the two girls. My ex-husband had already left to go back, and we before we could pick him up to drive him back to Connecticut, we had to go clean up his dorm and load all of his basically his entire life into his car. And so I decided that the girls should drive his car back, because I didn't want to chance them being in the car with him if something should go haywire. And so they drove his car. I put him in my car, and we started the long drive back to Connecticut. And I was fearful that he would just break out in the middle of an episode and think the government was trying to take me over or something.
Yeah.
I just didn't know what was going to happen. But I had stopped at CVS. I got his prescriptions filled. And at one point, he started screaming at me and grabbing at the driver's at driving, grabbing at the steering wheel. And I immediately pulled over, and I said, "This is not happening. I am not dying out here on a highway." And it's at night. We're
Wow.
trying to drive.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get this mentally challenged person back home safely. And the mother in me took over, and I pulled over and I grabbed the medication out of the bag, and I took the pills out that he was supposed to take. And I said, "Take these pills right now." And he kind of was shocked, and he looked at me, and I handed him a bottle of water. And he took the pills, and I said, "Hey, get your ass in the back seat and lay down until we get home." And
Mhm.
his 6'1" self crawled into the back of my SUV, and he crawled, laid himself out in the back seat and just went to sleep.
Wow.
And I remember saying, "Thank you, God."
Yes.
And the girls were texting, "Is everything okay? What's going on?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, we'll be fine." And we continued the drive home.
Wow.
And, we got him back to Connecticut by some grace of God. And then we had to learn how to adjust to this new world that we were in.
Mhm.
And what will it mean living with someone prone to these episodes? And what I came to realize was hypomania,
Mm.
where he's not stable, but he's not in the middle of an episode. He's just in that middle zone where he's not
Mhm.
himself, and he's agitated, and he's saying things that my son would never,
Right.
ever say to me or anyone else. And that's been the hardest part. Just, as you read your serenity prayer, I have the same prayer in my
Right.
bedroom on a plaque, and I see it every night before I go to bed and every morning when I wake up. And I had to accept
Yes,
those things I could not change.
absolutely. That's so hard, isn't it? It's hard. But it's powerful, and I love that, that prayer helps you, helps me every day. Most days I wear it around my neck. The
Yeah.
acceptance of a child that like you said, you birthed, you
Yeah. Yeah.
raised, and you're seeing this child in a different
Yeah.
space. Um, I love that you shared about hypomania, a mild form of mania
Mhm.
marked by elation and hyperactivity. And it's interesting. I never thought about that word until just now. I think my eldest has is in that space
Mhm.
sometimes. And it's
Mhm.
difficult. And so it's
Yeah.
really hard to accept that you have this beautiful child, this beautiful mind, this
Yeah.
brilliant
Yeah.
being that is not of
Not of himself.
not
Yeah,
themselves.
but the you've lived with this person, like I said, you birthed this person, and he's still my baby. And I
Yeah,
still knew he was there somewhere. And, the other part of that prayer is have the courage to change the things you can.
that's right.
And that's where the mother steps in.
Yeah,
And, you just can't stop trying to
right.
get them where they need to be.
That's right. And that's what you're doing. And that's why this is so helpful and your book is so
Mhm.
incredible. Um, there's a question that Medina that says, was there anything identified that caused him trauma? Last week we spent a conversation about intergenerational trauma and
Yeah.
triggers. Or was there any sort of trigger that you
So that is the hardest part, because there were so many possible triggers. So many, and you never know what was the actual trigger. But, as I spent so much time after this all happened trying to reflect on, did this really happen out of the blue and all of a sudden? Because my initial reaction was like, all of a sudden my son had
yeah,
this mental breakdown. But then I started to think, well, okay, so he was prone to having these anger management spurts when he was young. And I recall one day he punched a hole through the wall, because he had gotten so irritated and aggravated with his sisters. I don't remember which one, but I had always told him, don't you ever, ever raise a hand to your sisters. And so instead of hitting one of them, he hit a wall.
hmm,
And there was another time he got so angry, he slammed the shower door and the entire glass shattered. And those things we would look at as, Dre's got anger management issues.
right,
And I sent him to a therapist when he was about 10 or 11. And we tried to get to the bottom of his anger management. And I thought it was because his dad and I had divorced a couple years before that. And maybe he wasn't managing that well. And maybe he was angry about the fact that we were no longer together. But even back then, he refused to go to a therapist. We all went
Mm.
as a family. He said, I don't want my friends knowing I'm going to see a shrink. And this was
And this was
his
10 or 11. This he was
at
10 or
10 or
11.
11. That
Wow.
was the stigma that attached to going to
Mm.
therapy.
Wow.
And so we realized that if he's not willing to go, he's just going to go and sit there and not say anything and pout. And it's all just going to be a waste of time, a waste of money. And so we didn't make him go back. And it's like, that's one of those things where it's like, God, if I had just found a way to get him to keep going and work through whatever was challenging him at the time. But there were other instances closer to when the incident happened. The summer before, he had, so this happened in October, like 6 weeks into the school year. That previous summer, he had a summer internship with my friend's advertising company.
Mhm.
And he had been doing really great at the internship, but after he got out of work, he was driving around in his brand new birthday present. I bought him a
Mm.
used Porsche Cayenne for his 20th birthday.
Wow.
He loved that car, and he was driving around with all of his friends, and they were hanging out, and he was meeting all these new friends. And it was a lot of times friends want to be friends with you because you got a great new car to cruise the
Right.
streets in.
Right.
And so they spent a lot of time doing that. And one day he was with some of these newer friends, and I got a call. No, I didn't get a call. I was sitting at home and I got a feeling something was not right. You know, you have that mother's instinct.
Yes.
And I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, "Hey, how you doing?" And he was sounding out of breath. And he's like, "Hey, mom." And I said, "What's going on? What's up?" And he said, "I just got into a fight." And I said, "You what? Like, what happened?"
Mm.
And he said, "Well, I was with my friend, and I don't remember the friend's name." He goes, "We were in his car. I was in the car, and he was trying to show off in front of his girlfriend. And apparently, this guy had reached into the car and grabbed Dre by the shirt. And he thought Dre had been laughing at him, but Dre said, I wasn't even laughing at him. And when the guy pulled Dre by the shirt, Dre jumped out of the car and started to pummel the guy.
Oh God.
I learned about what really
Mm.
happened from one of my very good friends who lives in the complex where this all
Mhm.
happened. She
Mhm.
happened to hear the commotion, looked out her window, and saw Dre beating this guy mercilessly.
Oh no.
Said he was beating him in the
Mm.
face. The guy's nose was broken, it was bleeding. He said, and she said, Medina, he just wouldn't stop. It was like a person possessed. Those were her words.
Wow.
And she called me after I hung up from talking to Dre and told me about what happened because, of course, Dre hadn't given me the whole flavor of what had happened. And she was concerned because the guy had an older brother who had just gotten out of jail. And I was like, oh my God, like, what have you done, Dre? You've gotten involved and you pissed off the wrong people and they're going to come after you. And so I called his dad and we were like, Dre, you need to go to your dad's house. His dad lived way out in the suburbs. You need to go to your dad's house and lay low until you go back to school. Like, this is not good.
Right.
And he convinced me, Mom, it's fine, it's fine. And eventually the guy who he had beat up came to apologize because he realized he had started it.
Wow.
And he and Dre kind of worked it out. But in the back of my mind, I still kept thinking, did I create this monster that just like that beat this person up? Because as a little child, Dre was the kid getting beat up. He was the kid getting bit by other little toddlers and always hit. And he'd cry and he'd go to the teacher, and the teacher wouldn't do anything, or he'd cry to me. And when he was 5 or 6, I taught him how to fight.
Wow.
And I always wondered, was that the right thing? And I remember holding up my fist, like, is that all you got? Hit me, hit me. And I
Wow.
would I would teach him to punch me in the stomach, and I would tighten my muscles, like punch me. Like, if somebody hits you, you make sure you hit them back harder than they hit you. Don't let them know never, they're never gonna hit you again. Like, you are not that
Right.
person. And I didn't want him to grow up weak and being
Mm.
abused and being
Right.
beat up by other kids. What I thought later is that I created this monster who wasn't able to manage things outside of hitting the person.
Yes. Mhm.
And
I
as
don't know that
mothers,
you
we do what we think is best at the
absolutely.
time, but I always wonder to this day, like, did I give him the wrong lesson? Was I teaching him not to show hurt and pain and to always feel like he had to be tough? He always had to be that fighter.
Mhm.
And you just never know, especially with Black
You never
boys. It's so hard.
know. We never know. I think that first of all, you have to, forgive yourself. I had to forgive myself for the things that I wish I could change now.
Yeah, yeah,
But you never know. I think that you did what you thought was right at the time, and there's something really important about being able to defend yourself and speak up for yourself.
yeah,
There's something really important there, and I also think that there's an opportunity for us as Black moms to teach our boys how to work through their emotions with words and how to communicate
yeah.
about
Yep,
their emotions.
yep.
Um, because oftentimes we don't, a boy and a girl will fall, same fall. The little girl
Uh-huh.
will like, oh, let me clean that up. The little boy is
Yeah,
like, come
yeah.
on, now let's get together, keep,
Yep,
stay
yep.
strong, whatever that is. And so we don't give our boys space to
Okay.
cry and space to talk,
Yeah,
space to
yeah.
be
Right.
vulnerable.
So, right, but getting back to your question though, in terms of
Yes.
triggers, I think there were so many things going on politically. Trump had just taken
Yes.
office. Dre was, up against racists every day. Um, there were, like I mentioned before, so many Black men getting killed by police, and us, I'm trying to talk to Dre about that and what that meant
Yes.
to be a Black man. Dre had always grown up in a very white environment. He went to a mostly white private school. He had a handful of Black friends, but most of the guys he hung out with were white. And when he got to Maine, I think it was the first time that real life hit him in the face
Yeah.
that you are a Black man and people will regard you as that. Um,
Mm.
and so that was a big part of it. But there also were things going on in the family which were unbeknownst to me at the time that Dre had gotten wind of, that I think also was a big trigger for him. And then I noticed somebody asked in the chat, because they're popping up here, was there a history of mental illness in the family? And the answer to that is yes. I
Mhm.
think there's probably a history of mental illness in everybody's family,
Yes.
but in mine particularly, my mother suffers from what I believe is bipolar. To my knowledge, she's never been diagnosed, and as far as I know, she probably never will be, despite my urging her to. But that's something that I always dealt with as a child, for to a very degree. She had, as I can recall, probably two or three episodes throughout my lifetime. And it was nothing as severe as the episodes that Dre was having. And so it even took me a while to connect the two
Yes.
until, someone was telling me that it's genetic. And I was like, oh my God. Like,
Mhm.
yeah. And so that made more sense of it as I started to read more about that genetic trait, and so how so many of us have that genetic mental illness gene under
Right.
the surface. And for some of us, we live with it our entire lives, and there's nothing traumatic enough to trigger it from coming to the surface. But some people just do, and we all have just a different psychological makeup.
That's
And
right.
I realized that with my older sister, may she rest in peace. She passed away 2 years ago. Um,
Right.
but I realized that in talking to her, she said, "You've always just been so like unemotional." And I said, "Well, what do you mean unemotional? Like, I'm sensitive." And she said, "That's not what I mean. Like, you have a way of managing through trauma so much better than I do." And it hit me because she would always hold on to things. She would talk about things that happened when we were kids, like she hadn't gotten over it. And I was like, "Girl, brush that off." And I've always been able to do that where she had a hard that. And so I realized that even among kids who grow up in the same house, sometimes they can be very, very different in terms of how they process trauma and how they manage triggers, where one will be okay and the other will end up having an episode. So
Right.
it's very, very unusual, but it's a lot of learning that goes into understanding that.
It's a lot of learning, and I wanna ask about that, but I wanna make sure we get to this, question. Is he still participating in his mental health care? And if so, what has helped to keep him there or in care, in
He
care?
is, thank God. So in the book, I talk about my plan to get Dre finally into what I wanted him into, which was long-term care. And of course, Dre was always refusing because I'm not going to get locked up. You're trying to send me away. And I finally realized that in order for him to get care, he's got to hit rock bottom. And hitting rock bottom was a scary, scary thought because
Yes.
hitting rock bottom could mean that he disappears and becomes homeless. And I would say to him, like, Dre, if you don't go into care, you cannot live here. And he would say, fine, I'll just live under a bridge.
Mm,
And I never wanted to
right.
ever bear the thought of not knowing where my child is. So this notion of letting him hit rock bottom, I had to take very seriously. Like, what does that look like? How do I make sure that his rock bottom is still going to be in a protected zone? And so, what led up to his finally getting treatment? I had moved him back to Connecticut, which is what he wanted to do. He was living here in Atlanta with me. I moved him back to Connecticut and had been paying his rent in this apartment for about 2 years. The people from the management have been calling me. We've got to evict him. He's out of control. He broke his front door down. He's got people living in his apartment against, in violation of the lease. And I was talking to Dre and I said, Dre, you're getting evicted. And he said, well, okay, so, and I'm like, well, you know what getting evicted means? You're going to have nowhere to live. And he said, well, just get me another place to live. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so I was trying to figure out how do we move towards this eviction process. And
Mm,
I kept saying, well, your other option is to go to a long-term care facility. Then you won't have to be homeless. You can just move into the long-term care facility. And when you come out, we can figure out how to get you a new apartment. No, no,
mhm.
no, you're not gonna trick me into getting locked up. So I had a great relationship that I developed with a doctor at Hartford Healthcare. He runs the Institute of Living in Connecticut.
Okay.
And he was trying to help me strategize on what to do to get some help for Dre. He said, if you can get him to the emergency room at Hartford Hospital, call me when he gets there. I will reach out to my colleagues, let them know the situation. They will hold him there, and we will at least get him into the psych ward at Hartford Hospital and figure out how to get him into long term care. So that was the plan. Except when I would call Dre, I said, Dre, why don't you just go in for a psychological evaluation? Because at this time, Dre had been in a state of mania, it seems like for probably a year,
Mm,
maybe not that long, but it was definitely since my sister passed away. And he had such a hard time there. He ended up missing her funeral because we had to get him committed involuntarily. And that was a long, drawn out thing. Um, but he had been in this state of mania for so long that we were all so concerned that he's going to end up getting shot. He's going to roll up on somebody in this state, in the streets of Hartford. Someone is going. And so we finally he called my ex-husband, and I can't remember if he called or the police called. He had been beat up in
mm,
West Hartford, and they
oh,
had him in an ambulance heading to St. Francis Hospital. And my ex-husband
mm,
called me, and I said, tell them to send him to Hartford Hospital. Don't bring him to St. Francis. So the ambulance gets averted, takes him to Hartford Hospital. At the time, I was in LA with my youngest daughter visiting my oldest daughter. We were in a restaurant having brunch, and I'm running outside to have these conversations on my phone. And I called Dr. Santa Pietro from Hartford Hospital, and I tell him Dre's in an ambulance. He's on his way to the hospital. I call the hospital ER and I tell them, and I try to get a hold of them to tell them what's going on. There's a patient coming in. He's a mental health patient. Do not discharge him. Dr. Santa Pietro is calling the psychiatrist on staff there. And when somebody at one of the inpatient nurses or intake nurses finally got the psychiatric nurse on the phone, she said, oh my God, he was just discharged. We gave him a prescription for opioids and discharged him. And
oh,
I'm like,
God.
catch him. She literally ran to the front door and threw herself between Dre and the exit door of the ER.
Wow.
and said, I'm sorry, we were not supposed to discharge you. The doctor still needs to see you. Can you come with me? And
Oh,
Dre
wow.
followed her and they brought him back to the psychiatric part of the ER.
Mm,
And that's when they did the evaluation and said, I'm sorry, son, we can't let you go. And he stayed there. They didn't have a room in the psych ward, of course. So Dr. Santa Pietro got on the phone. They were trying to find a room for him. Dre laid on a gurney for 2 days. And I was calling him and I said, Dre, you have to stay. Like your mind must be exhausted. You are exhausted. Like just stay there and let them help you. And so he stayed in the ER voluntarily because I think he
voluntarily.
was just exhausted at that point. And they finally found a bed
Mm,
in Westport, which was like an hour and a half away from where he was. And they transported him by ambulance to the psych ward at St. Vincent's Hospital. And that's where we were blessed by this social worker. Her name is Sophia.
mm,
And I sing her praises to this day because they were ready to discharge him again
mm,
after a few days. And I said, you have to keep him there longer. And while they kept him there, I flew from LA. I packed my stuff. I flew to Hartford. I got to his apartment. I hired some movers to pack up his entire apartment, moved all of his stuff into storage over a period of like a day and a half. By the time the social worker called me and said they can't hold him any longer, they're discharging him, I said, where's he going to go? And they said, well, he says he has an apartment in Hartford. I said, no, he doesn't. He was evicted. He's homeless.
mm,
And my thought was, now that he knows he's homeless, this is rock bottom. He's going to have to agree to go into a long-term facility. So she said, well, we do have shelters. We can give him the names of some shelters that he can go into. And I said, does he look like he's in the state of mind to just go live in a
mm.
shelter? Like, is this the answer for people who don't have
Right,
anywhere to go, who
right.
are mentally challenged? And I said, like, what would you do if this were your son? Would you release him
Absolutely.
to a homeless shelter? And I said, there's got to be a program that he could go to. And I said, give me time enough to figure this out. And I then called a couple of friends.
Mm,
I happen to know a few people in high places. One was the commissioner of the Department of Social Services. One was a very senior person, and I don't want to sort of get them in trouble, but I called them and they have been long-term friends of mine. And I explained the situation. And one of them told me about a program called DEMAS, the Department of Mental Health and Addictive Services in Connecticut. And she said, I'm going to put you in touch with the woman who runs that program. And I called that person and had a long conversation. We talked for over an hour about Dre and his story and what I had gone through trying to get long term care for him. And she then sent out an email to a bunch of people. I don't even know who these names were in this email, but the title of her email was Concerned Mom. And she basically recounted the story of what I had been dealing with Dre, who was this promising, bright, intelligent, attractive, smart, athletic, polite, caring kid. And somebody called me and said, we have a housing program and we can try to get him into that program. And I said, oh, thank God. And then the person from the program called me and said, I got the message that we need to try to find a room for your son, but we have a wait list and it's like 40 people on it. So it's going to be a long time. And I said, oh, you've got to be kidding me. You've got to find a spot for him. So I then started making more calls and making more calls. And eventually somebody was moved by God
Wow.
to find a spot for Dre. And I remember just dropping to my knees when they called me because
Mm,
what that meant was he would have free housing,
yes.
free therapy every week, a nurse that comes to his furnished apartment and administers his medication every night to make sure that he is taking it. And it takes a while to develop that habit of taking it on your own. So that's exactly what he needed. But it also meant that somebody else's child had been bumped
Yes.
to make room for mine. And I was okay with that. But I also felt so bad that there's just not enough room for everybody.
Right. Mm,
And he's been in that program for a year. And his therapist is wonderful. She's a Hispanic woman who really cares about him. Everybody that's working with him sees his promise. He's now trying to get his transcript from Bowdoin, his transcript from Morehouse. He's like, I want to finish college.
that's awesome.
He's like, I want to get back on with my life now. Like he's really feeling like he's got this under control. And there have been times where we've had this
Mm,
false sense of Dre's better now when Dre really wasn't better now. So part of me is trying to hold back on the excitement of it
mm,
or the truth of it, because with mental illness, there's always a trigger that could probably set them back again. And we pray that doesn't happen,
yes.
but I leave space for that as a
Right.
possibility for him. And it's something that he's gonna have to manage the rest of his
Right.
life.
Right.
And I just hope and pray that he has come to grips with that, and
Right.
he doesn't have this false impression a lot of people do, that, oh, I'm good now, I don't
Right.
need that medication anymore, I got this. And he doesn't realize that he's good because he's continuing to take the medication every day.
Right. But what just a riveting story. And the reality is, because of your advocacy for your child and for your calling and pushing and leveraging every resource you have and all and everybody in your phone book, you were able to get him from going to a homeless shelter to going into a place that was that's run by the government, but that gives him the care he needs.
Yeah.
That is the blessing, that you are a blessing for your child. And you've done such an incredible job to support him and to love him and to do all the things that we're supposed to do as parents. And so I want to just come. One person asked a question a while ago around, do you have a power of attorney or guardianship for Dre?
So I don't. Dre's one of those people, because he was so adamant about not getting locked up, even when he was stable, he refused to give anybody ownership over that decision. And
Mhm.
that's part of the challenge. We were supposed to be talking about when your kid refuses care. So that's been one of the challenges when he has refused care, that I am constantly trying to get him involuntarily committed. But without a
Right,
power of attorney, they're like, he's over 18. He makes the and Dre says, I don't want to go, they would say, okay, fine, he doesn't have to go. And so at one point, somebody explained to me that I could get temporary power of attorney or guardianship over him. And what I had to do was basically go down to the probate court, fill out an application, and
yeah,
explain his mental state and what had been going on, and convince a judge to give me this temporary power of attorney. And so what that meant was I had to have a witness. And the only witness that I could get to go with me, and the only one who really saw Dre in this state, was his younger sister. And she didn't want to be that person that had to go down and testify against her brother like that. But she finally realized that's really what he needs. And so the two of us went down and filled out the paperwork and told the story. And the judge granted me temporary guardianship.
okay,
I then had to call the police and have the police accompany me to the and I laugh every time I have to say this, but they accompanied me to the Motel 6 where I had him housed,
got it.
because I was so afraid of what might happen if he slips from this mania to a true manic state. in the house with me, and particularly in the house with his younger sister.
Right.
And I kept saying to him, if you don't go and agree to get treatment, you cannot stay here. And so I put him in a Motel 6 because it was cheap enough that I could afford to pay it long term. And that's where he was staying. And so when the police officers showed up, it was four of them. And I huddled them in the parking lot at the motel. And I talked to them as if they were my children. And I said, don't either of you harm a hair on his head. And I said, I will sue this entire police department. And I tried to use everything I had to
Mm.
impress upon them how they needed to treat my child. And I said, I don't want you to put a hand on him. I will escort him out, but I just need you all there so he knows this is serious and now he needs to come. And when we finally got there and knocked on the door, and Dre opened the door and he saw the police officers there, and he looked at me like, how could you? Like, what have you done? And I told him how he had to go with the officers, and they had a court order to take him to the mental health hospital. And he voluntarily came out and he went with them. And there were times where I was just thanking God that he had at least the soundness of mind to
Yeah.
not try to be combative or to fight the
Or
police
run,
officers,
fight,
because
run,
there were
all the things.
several times where the police had to get involved. And knock on wood, every time Dre humbled himself and obliged. There
Yeah.
were some times I do recall though where he was in a police officer's face, but the
Yeah.
officer kind of understood what was going on and they just kind
Right.
of backed up from him, you know. But
Blessing. That's a blessing. You've had
it's
such a divine blessing. It's been a journey. One
yes.
person asked, I'd love this for you to air, and then we're out of time, unfortunately. I could talk with you all day. But one person says, so mom, what are you doing to take care of you? I hear and feel your stress, agony, and
uh,
burnout over the situation. And you just said, you, you know, and she says, I've been there. I've been there. So what are you doing to
yeah.
take care of you?
What do I do to take care of me? I travel a lot. Um, I try to have these moments where I compartmentalize pretty easily. And so I am fortunately one of those people. I'm able to put Dre's situation in a box sometimes and close the box and put it over here. And now I'm going to focus on happier things or other things that bring me joy. I've tried to set my life up so that I am following my passion, so that every day I feel like what I'm doing is taking care of me, is feeding into me and what brings me joy. So I started pursuing an acting career. When I'm rehearsing a script,
Awesome.
I'm able to
Mhm.
take myself out of the situation that I was in and just move myself into the character of the person I'm
Mm.
portraying. And surprisingly, that did a lot of good for me. I sold a stressful business and now I'm doing real estate developing, which is something I love. So doing that every day brings me joy. Um, Talking to my girls and just enjoying life, you know, I don't, it doesn't take a lot for me to engage in self-care. I think mentally I've been, and you know, I hate to say this because as Black women we tend to say, oh, you know, we have this superwoman phenomenon, but fortunately for me, I have been a survivor. I've dealt as a kid growing up in a very hostile family before my parents divorced, and with my mother with this condition. And so I've been conditioned to handle a lot of things and take it in stride and to not let it really impact me mentally. You know, I was seeing a therapist for a while. The therapist I was seeing got diagnosed with cancer and could no treat with me. I then got another therapist, and I realized like maybe I'm okay, you know, trying to manage this the way I've managed it. But I haven't blocked out the notion that maybe I need some group type of therapy. I tend to be a group person. I'm an extrovert. I get my energy from other people. And
Yes.
I'm thinking now like maybe some type of support group for other
Yeah.
Black women, maybe coming onto these calls
I
more
think
often might
coming on
be good
here.
for me. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
So I love everything you said. And yes, that is what we're here for. And I think this is a support group. We are
Yeah,
here and all on this journey together in different ways, different spaces, but ultimately, what we share is the love of our children and the love of our loved ones, and some are taking care of elders and children at the same
yeah,
time,
yeah.
but we're all in this
Stop.
space helping one another. And your story today has been so incredibly powerful and moving. And people are saying, I've been in tears this entire meeting. I feel your pain, but I see your hope and the strong
Yeah,
faith you have in God. God is able, He can and will not fail. I'm so happy to hear how things have turned around for you and your family. I know it's still a struggle. I'm just reading some of the comments.
yeah.
This was so good. One of your sorors is saying,
Oh,
it appears that
praise
you're on
God.
the right track with your son now. I pray the rest of us find a way to make progress with our children.
Yeah,
So,
I pray that you all do. There's
yeah,
a there's a section in the book, when I was thinking about writing it, it was because so many other parents had started to reach out to me because I had put my story on social media, and people started to reach out in my DMs and texting and wanted to get advice and guidance on how to deal with their own situation. And I was spending so much time talking to other families. I said, maybe I'll just write a book and then start to talk about it more publicly to help people who are dealing with similar situations. So in this book, if you guys haven't read it, I'm not trying to just promote my own book, but I really think it's going to be helpful for so many people because I not only tell my story, but I provide some guidance, some reflections on things I should have caught while raising my son, or different things I should have done in terms of being more open to not just him but all my kids, their emotional well-being, as opposed to just their academics and making sure they're
absolutely.
prepared for college. There's a huge emotional component that as parents we never grew up with our parents focusing on that,
That's right.
and so
Not at
we
all.
never learned to parent that way. But we've got to change the way we're parenting our kids. And so I talk a
Absolutely.
lot about that. I talk a lot about there's a bunch of resources that my oldest daughter, who happens to be on the call, I saw her name pop up. My oldest daughter, Taylor Jett, put together an amazing set of resources from articles and podcasts and books that really speak to mental illness, particularly in the Black community, that are so, so helpful. And when
Absolutely.
I talked to Dre before I wrote the book, I said, in order for me to tell my story, I have to tell some of your story. And
Yes.
are you okay with that? And he said, thank you, Mom. I'm so glad you're
Yes.
writing that because it's going to help a lot of people. And he said,
Yes.
how can I help? And I was so taken aback that he wanted to help. And so I came up with some questions for him. And one of the questions was, what advice would you give to other parents dealing with
Yes.
children in a similar situation? And another question I asked him was, you were always so adamant against going to the hospital for care. Why?
Yes.
And he answered those questions, and I included them in his responses in the epilogue to the book. And so you get not only my perspective, but you
It's
also get the
perspective.
perspective of someone who's gone through it, and what he would tell parents that they should be thinking about and doing with their
That's
children.
wonderful. And I think that's exactly right. We had a young man speak here once that says we talk often about the illness, but we don't talk to the people dealing with it. And so I love that you have that perspective. I did put in the chat the name of the book, and I also put the link to Amazon. So please support. And it sounds like the book is incredible and has all kinds of rich information as well as the perspective from Dre. Thank you for being here this
Oh,
Sunday. We'd
it's
love to have
my
you
pleasure.
back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And I just want to reiterate before I close this out with a short prayer, this really is a support group. And so if um, we've been here for 4 years coming out of a similar situation, that's the spirit of which this was born.
Yeah.
We have open sessions once a month and we encourage people to share. But it's intended to be that, and would love to have you come back and be here with us in our village. So just know that. And thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing and for being here. I'm going to close this out with a short prayer. Dear Father, thank you so much for allowing us to be here this morning. Thank you for Medina Jet, for her vulnerability and for sharing her story with her beautiful son, Dre, and all of her children. Father, please protect our children, check and protect all of our sons and daughters, and help our adult children and loved ones get the help they need. Help us continue to advocate for our children, and in doing so, help us also learn to forgive ourselves, to give ourselves grace, and to know that we have done the best we can. Help us surrender worry because we know you are in control. Whew. Here's to a peaceful, powerful, positive, productive, and loving week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for being here. You have moved me, and
Thank you.
I hope
And
God continues to bless you and all of us. Have a wonderful week, everyone. And we'll be back next Sunday for our call with Dr. Vicki Johnson next Sunday morning. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day, everyone.
thank you.